Chapter 2B. Since she had been living in other people's houses and had had no ayah, she had begun to feel lonely and to think queer thoughts which were new to her. She began to wonder why she had never seemed to belong to anyone, even when her father and mother had been alive. Other children seemed to belong to their fathers and mothers, but she never really seemed to be anyone's little girl. She had had servants and food and clothes, but no one had taken any notice of her. She did not know that this was because she was a disagreeable child. But then, of course, she did not know she was disagreeable. She often thought other people were, but she did not know that she was so herself. She thought Miss Medlock was the most disagreeable person she'd ever met, with her common, highly colored face and her common fine bonnet. When the next day they set out on their journey to Yorkshire, she walked through the station to the railway carriage with her head up, trying to keep as far away from her as she could, because she did not want to seem to belong to her. It would have made her very angry to think people imagined that she was her little girl. But Miss Medlock was not in the least disturbed by her and her thoughts. She was the kind of woman who would stand no nonsense from young ones. At least, that is what she would have said if you'd asked her. She had not wanted to go to London just when her sister Maria's daughter was going to be married. But she had a comfortable, well-paid place as housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and the only way in which she could keep it was to do at once what Mr. Archibald Craven told her to do. She never dared even to ask a question. Captain Lennox and his wife died of the cholera, Mr. Craven had said in his short, cold way. Captain Lennox was my wife's brother, and I am their daughter's guardian. The child is to be brought here. You must go to London and bring her here yourself. So she packed her small trunk and she made the journey. Mary sat in her corner of the railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. She had nothing to read or to look at, and she had folded her thin little black-gloved hands in her lap. Her black dress made her look more yellow than ever, and her limp, light hair straggled from under her black crepe hat. A more marred-looking young one I never saw in my life, Miss Medlock thought. Marred is a Yorkshire word that means spoiled and pettish. She had never seen a child who sat so still without doing anything. And at last she got tired of watching her, and she began to talk in a brisk, hard voice. I suppose I may as well tell you something about the place you're going to, she said. Do you know anything about your uncle? No, said Mary. You never heard your father and mother talk about him? No, said Mary, frowning. She frowned because she remembered that her father and her mother had never talked to her about anything in particular. Certainly they never told her things. Muttered Miss Medlock, staring her queer, unresponsive little face. She did not say any more for a few minutes. Then she began again. I suppose you might as well be told something to prepare you. You're going to an odd place. Mary said nothing at all, and Miss Medlock looked rather discomfited by her apparent indifference. But after taking a breath, she went on. Not that it's, not a grand big place in a gloomy way, and Mr. Craven's proud of it in his way, and that's gloomy enough too. The house is 600 years old, and it's on the edge of the moor. And there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them shut up and locked. There's pictures and paintings, fine old furniture, and things that have been there for ages. There's a big park round it, and gardens with trees, with branches trailing to the ground, some of them. She paused and took another breath. But there's nothing else, she ended suddenly. Mary had begun to listen in spite of herself. It all sounded so unlike India, and anything new rather attracted her. but she did not intend to look as if she were interested. That was one of her unhappy, disagreeable ways. So she sat still. "Well," said Miss Medlock, "what do you think of that?" "Nothing," she answered. "I know nothing about such places." That made Miss Medlock laugh, a short sort of laugh. She said, "But you are like an old woman. Don't you care?" "It doesn't matter," said Mary, "whether I care or not." "You're right enough there," said Miss Medlock. "It doesn't. What you're to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for, I don't know, unless because it's the easiest way. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." She stopped herself as if she had just remembered something. "He's got a crooked back," she said, "and that set him wrong. And he was a young man. He got no good at all out of all his money and the big place until he was married." Mary's eyes turned towards her in spite of her intention not to seem to care. She had never thought of a hunchback being married, and she was a trifle surprised. Miss Medlock saw this, and as she was a talkative woman, she continued with more interest. This was one way of passing some of the time, at any rate. Oh, she was a sweet, pretty thing. And he'd had walked the world over to give her a blade of grass if she wanted. Nobody thought she'd marry him, but she did. And people said she married him for his money, but she didn't. She didn't. And when she died, Mary gave a little involuntary jump. "Oh, did she die?" she exclaimed, quite without meaning to. She had just remembered a fairy tale that she'd once read, and it had been about a poor hunchback and a beautiful princess, and it had made her suddenly sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven. "Yes, she died," Miss Medlock answered, "and it made him odder than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people. Most of the time he goes away. When he is at Misselthwaite, he shuts himself up in the west wing, and he won't let anybody but Pitcher come and see him. Pitcher's an old fellow, but he took care of him when he was a child, and he knows his ways." It sounded like something in a book, and it did not make Mary feel cheerful. A house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, with their doors locked. A house on the edge of a moor, whatever a moor was, sounded dreary. A man with a crooked back who shut himself up, also. She stared out of the window with her lips pinched together, and it seemed quite natural that the rain should have begun to pour down in gray, slanting lines, and splash and stream down the window panes. If the pretty wife had been alive, she might have made things cheerful by being something like her own mother, and by running in and out and going to parties and looking beautiful as she had done in frocks full of lace. But she was not there anymore. "You needn't expect to see him, because 10 to 1 you won't," said Miss Medlock. "And you mustn't expect that there will be people to talk to. You'll have to play about and look after yourself. You'll be told what rooms you can go into and what rooms you're to keep out of. There's gardens enough, but when you're in the house, don't go wandering and poking about. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I shall not want to go poking about," said sour little Mary, and was just as suddenly as she had begun to be rather sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven, she began to cease to be sorry and to think he was unpleasant enough to deserve all the things that had happened to him. And she turned her sour little face towards the streaming panes of the window of the railway carriage and gazed out at the gray rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on forever and ever. She watched it so long and steadily that the grayness grew heavier and heavier, and before long she fell asleep.